Joining the show to discuss is former Montreal litigator turned current Florida rumbler, Viva Fry. Hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. What was your reaction seeing this ruling?
Well, it's about damn time was my initial reaction because, I've been following this from the very beginning. The federal courts in Canada, it's not that they haven't been reliable. They've been reliably bad as relates to protecting charter rights. The federal courts declared these government-designated quarantine facilities totally lawful, not violative of charter rights. So this is a refreshing white pill of the week, that you have at least one judge with the courage, to stand up to the political pressures and issue this ruling, because the context is a little bit complex. There was a public commission to investigate into the circumstances surrounding the invocation of the Emergencies Act. That was a political process where this guy named Commissioner Rouleau concluded that Justin Trudeau was justified in invoking the act. And I said, when that happened, there's going to be no federal court that's going to override that sort of extrajudicial decision. But this judge said, yeah, look, that's a political process. This is a judicial one. I've heard the evidence. I'm susceptible of being overturned on appeal. There's judicial oversight for my decision. And I am differing respectfully from Commissioner Rouleau, who said Trudeau did nothing wrong.
Wow. So do you think the victims of this edict back then are actually going to get some justice? People whose bank accounts were drained, people who were brutalized by police?
No. We'll attenuate the white pill. No. For the time being, there's the question as to whether or not this is going to have an impact on the ongoing criminal, and I'll say persecutions, because I don't believe that these are legitimate prosecutions. But there'll be no meaningful redress at an individual level. In my humble estimation, I wouldn't expect the government to pay millions of dollars to the people who are currently detained in pretrial detention on charges of, if you go to the Coutts men at Coutts, Alberta, they're in pretrial detention on charges of conspiracy to commit homicide. Other people, Tamara Leach, Chris Barber, Pat King, and a number of other protesters who were detained in pretrial detention on mischief charges, they're not going to get redress. The only solution here is going to be the political one, and the political ramifications of what this federal court justice has just ruled, they're going to be massive. But if I'm any one of the individuals who was brutalized, had my bank account frozen, in the context of the violent suppression of that protest, I'm not holding my breath for any meaningful individual redress.
Canada's looking more like a scary place to live these days. Yikes. So do you think Trudeau will be punished for overstepping the highest law in the land?
I do not think he will be punished in any meaningful sense other than the political sense. Canada is scheduled for mandatory elections, or at least the scheduled elections, in 2025. So he's got at most a year left before he feels the political consequences. There is a question as to whether or not in Canada we have a parliamentary system. If there's enough will to push for a vote of no confidence, then we might have elections sooner than 2025, because they can call them now, but they have to call them no later than next year. So we'll see. But nobody's going to jail. Those who went to jail, they're not going to get checks for millions of dollars like Omar Khadr. I don't know if you know that story, but this guy, locked up in Guantanamo for participating in terroristic attacks overseas, Canadian citizen, paid $10.5 million by the Canadian government. No, I would not hold my breath if I'm any of the individuals here. But if this does not get overturned in appeal, and Chrystia Freeland has announced that they're going to appeal this decision, then at least we have the good precedent that comes out of all of this. My biggest concern is that this is going to get overturned in appeal, because I've read through the decision. It's 190 pages, including exhibits, yada, yada. But the judge, not created some doubt, but left some doors open as to how the Court of Appeal can come in and say, yeah, it's not up to the judge to second guess what he said was a reasonable, something that he might have done himself under the circumstances. So there's room for the Court of Appeal to get in here and overturn it. If they appeal it and it gets ratified, my goodness, would that be great? But then they'll just appeal it to the Supreme Court of Canada, because, it doesn't cost them anything. It's taxpayer dollars. So we'll see. The next step is going to be the appeal, but that's going to take a heck of a long time.
So the judge had ruled that the Emergencies Act is a last resort option, and Trudeau was not in a last resort situation. Can you give us Americans some background on this Emergencies Act, what it was actually meant for?
So the Emergencies Act, like nobody was familiar with this until this occurred. The Emergencies Act supplanted or replaced what was known as the War Measures Act. So it is literally the replacement of the War Measures Act, which is a measure that you invoke, you implement during wartime. You know, like aerial bombings, people have to get locked in their houses, whatever. It's a War Measures Act replacement. It has only been used, it's either 2 or 3 times in the history of Canada, and Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was one of the previous people to have used it back in the FLQ crisis, which was the Front Libération de Québec, sort of a separatist terrorist group out of Quebec in the 70s. I think it was 1970, but I might be wrong on the date. And when Pierre Elliott Trudeau invoked it, there were literal pipe bombs being put in mailboxes, literally politicians being kidnapped and murdered. Pierre Laporte was a politician who was kidnapped, thrown in the trunk of a car, and murdered. So when Pierre Elliott invoked it, there was better reason than when Justin Trudeau invoked it. And even then, back in the day, they said Pierre Elliott went a little too far with it. So it's the last measure to invoke when all other existing laws and existing powers are inadequate to resolve a threat of national security, national infrastructure, etc. This was so egregiously on its face, unwarranted at the time, as evidenced by what happened at the time. There was a blockade on the border of Ontario and Michigan at the Windsor Bridge. That was resolved via court injunction. So, i.e., existing legal remedies sufficient to resolve the blockade. In Coutts, criminal charges, it was resolved without invoking the Emergencies Act. The Premier of Quebec didn't want to invoke the Emergencies Act. He said, we can deal with this. We got police and we can do it. There was no reason to do it. There was no national emergency. There was no meaningful or even real threat of violence. And it was unwarranted at the time, but Justin Trudeau was just itching to come down with a fist of fury on this peaceful protest that humiliated him and made him look like an absolute jackass at the international level. So it was pretextual. They were going to do it regardless, and they had to fabricate the pretext, but everyone at the time knew it was absolutely unwarranted. And this judge came to the conclusion. He said, look, it wasn't necessary. You had all the existing infrastructure, laws, capabilities to deal with it. And it was simply unreasonable under the circumstances. But, you know, the judge has to give everybody a little push and pull and give the Crown a little bit. So he compliments the Crown on the capacities of their attorneys and says, look, this protest went beyond reasonable protest. But nonetheless, it was egregious overreach, unwarranted, unreasonable, and there's your slap on the wrist.
Wow, incredible. It's almost like this Canadian convoy was like America's January 6th. That was January 6th for you guys. So it's good to see a little bit of justice from the judge, because as an American looking on, saying, why can't people peacefully assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances? You guys are getting your bank accounts drained for using what we do under the First Amendment. Scary stuff in Canada. Anyways, that's all the time we have for now. Viva Fry, thank you so much for coming on. Great talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.